My name is Connor.
And I'm Jason.
And you're listening to the Amazed and Perplexed podcast.
We're grateful that you joined us today for our podcast, the Amazed and Perplexed podcast. We wanted to have a message right here at the beginning that we're going to be talking about the Good Shepard, and at some point we bring up this dynamic of laying down your life. We want to make sure that it is clear that we are not equating laying down your life with allowing yourself to be abused. And that is a much more intricate situation. Who we are talking about are those people that aspire to lead well. Who we are talking to, and we assume that is you, are people that are aspiring to lead well and to follow well. And so that's how we apply this passage as two people that want to do that and recognize our weaknesses. But to the person that it leads out of a place of domination or leads out of a place that there's no love, that is a totally different conversation. And feel free to contact us if you find yourself in that spot and just need somebody to share that with, to pray with you about, and to maybe see what God could do in a conversation between us.
So, yes, we're talking about the Good Shepherd. And so that leads kind of to a natural question. Has there ever been a time, Jason, where you just felt like, man, somebody led you just well, they led you in a way that was good for you, it was good for your health, your spiritual life, or even just good for you in a moment and protected you from some outside or even maybe inside evil?
Yeah, I have I feel like I've been blessed with a lot of good people in my life. So my challenge right now is something concise, to share. I'll tell you what's fascinating to me is the one that always jumps out at me in terms of a concise experience, and I may have shared this before like 10 times, who knows, but is a situation where I was given some power in a situation, and I was exerting my power in a way that I felt very confident in. Like I thought, I am doing this, and I'm doing this right. And somebody pulled me aside, and I mean, the whole conversation was maybe 3 minutes. And this lady, she goes, Jason, I don't think this is about this situation at all. I think it's all about you. And I think you need to make it not about you before you can make a really good decision. And I'm telling you, I said nothing, because she kind of had a little bit of position of authority in this organization, I said nothing to her that I can recall, but I walked away and I was so mad. How dare she? Yeah. And I never have been the one where I'm a man, a woman shouldn't talk to me bad. I've always felt like that's really gross and not how Jesus walked at all, ever. But even I was reaching for what can I do to shut her down, in my own head. And I don't know how long that went. Yeah. I'd like to say it was 2 minutes, probably like 4 days,
Sure.
But eventually it hit me. I'm like, oh my gosh, she's right. Mm-hmm. And the fact she was able to see something in me that I could not see about myself. I mean, I felt now I see it self-righteous, because the authority I had was to be able to make a decision about somebody that was struggling with something that I used to struggle with and I had overcome. Oh. And so I felt so justified in saying, look, if I can overcome it, you should have overcome it. And that's self-righteousness. I mean, man, 101.
I love that perspective. And I think it's so important, because I think we'll talk maybe a little bit about it when we read through the passage and we do the whole episode. But when we talk about somebody leading us and somebody shepherding us, there's both an immediate effect, and there's also, I feel like a lot of times we focus on the immediate, this thing is happening. How do we lead somebody out of this immediate effect or this immediate situation? But I think, man, really good leadership. I think the leadership, the kind of leadership that the Holy Spirit wants to provide is leadership that helps you, leads you out of a situation and keeps on leading you, keeps on teaching you, keeps on informing you. So that was very similar kind of, not a similar situation. There was no anger, but I was interning as a youth intern for my now father-in-law, which that was a whole funny thing. There's just a whole bunch of funny things. I did not agree to be his intern before I started dating his daughter. So, whatever that means. But this was pretty early on in my internship with him. And we were, he gave me a lot of autonomy, and he took my input on a lot of different things, which, he'd been doing youth ministry at this point for 30 something years. So, and I'd done youth ministry for 5 months. So, I mean, good on him, but I can't imagine, I look at kids, I look at people now getting youth ministry, and they have all these bright-eyed and bushy-tailed, and have all these ideas, and I'm like, awesome, great, but I was like, but that's not going to work. That's not going to work. That's not going to work. And he never did that sort of thing with me. So, anyways, that's beside the point. We were working through a class, and he was like, "Hey, Connor, okay, it's Tuesday. We're teaching this. Go home and study, and then here's your part to teach on Wednesday night, and then I'll teach my part." And so I'm like, awesome, great. And so I go home, I study, we teach this class, and I go to sit in that next day on Thursday, and he says, "Hey, Connor, I just want to put something in front of you. I just kind of want to hear where you're coming from. On Tuesday, we said that we were going to teach on this, and then you taught on this, which was a completely opposite thing than we had talked about on Tuesday." And it's like, he was like, "Help me understand where you were coming from." And I had never realized this about myself, but what had happened is I had gone home, I had studied this passage, and this is kind of almost a prefix to Amazed and Perplexed. I got so excited about the passage and so excited about something random I'd found in the text that I just went a completely other direction, which could have been okay, and he would have been fine with, but I didn't communicate that to him. And so he was expecting me to teach on this one thing, but I got so excited about this other thing in Scripture that I just went to a completely different thing. And he was so gentle, and I respond so much better to just gentle, positive questioning, because if somebody comes at me with comes up with their yelling or demeaning, I just put my guards up, and it takes a lot more time to get through. But it's something that I've once it was pointed out to me, and not like he didn't come to me and say, "Connor, this is what I see in you and you're doing this." It was, hey, it was a helping lead me into this own conclusion. I was like, I do this all the time. I get so excited about something in my relationship that time with my girlfriend, or I get so excited about this thing, that thing. And I never then go on to communicate my change in perspective, or my change in new ways of looking at things. And this is something that I've continually just have to keep putting in front of me. But that was a really good example for me of a time where just through gentle questioning, through gentle leading, I kind of discovered this whole new aspect of myself, when it very easily could have been a thing where, like, hey, you said you were going to do this and you lied because you didn't do it, or cause there's 1,000 different ways that people could have led in that situation.
Are you trying to make me look stupid here?
Yes,
by setting me up with a passage I've not prepped. Yeah.
And then so that's one of those things that I'm very grateful for, that sort of interaction. I've had many of those interactions, but that's one that sticks out for me.
It's interesting about what sticks out to us. I was in a season of a lot of learning, in a school, this kind of thing. And if you'd have asked me, even 2 weeks after it happened, "Hey, how long will this stick with you?" I'd be like, "Yeah, I don't know, a day." I mean, it is one of the biggest deals because it was so personal, and it was one of those epiphanies that I was like, I had this huge blind spot and I didn't know it about myself. And see, I was just in a group this morning in a discussion. We have this safe space we've created. I'm in a discussion, and I'm still saying, I have so many layers of blind spots that at times I'm like, do I even know myself at all? Because I feel like every 3 months I'm like, oh, that was another blind spot I had. I mean, it's like so thick, and you form blind spots to protect yourself, to preserve yourself, And I think that's, I'm just still unpacking all the blind spots that I unintentionally created growing up and into young adulthood. But so it is, you can't predict what's going to stick with you.
Yeah. Well, this doesn't really have anything to do with our episode, but I think it's one of those things for me that every time I think I figured out all my blind spots, that should be a warning for me that I'm like, oh, wait a second. Like, if I think I figured them all out, that probably means that I've got a pretty glaring one, like just wanting to
right.
so that somebody wants to rub my nose in. Maybe God, maybe the people around me. I don't know. But I think that this is just something I'm excited to talk about this today. The effect, a lot of times in today's culture, I think rightly we talk about the negative effect that bad leadership, that bad shepherding can bring in a person's life. And I think it's important because that's happened a lot. That's happened in many different aspects and in many different contexts. But what I'm excited about here is to talk about, man, what does really true good leadership look like? What does true shepherding look like? And then, man, how much of a comfort is that for us?
So it's interesting. I had one context in mind when we started talking, 4 minutes ago, and now I have a little bit different. It's the same basic passage. We're in John 10, but I think I want to frame it a little bit differently in terms of what we actually read. We'll start in John 10, verse 11, and then I'll wrap up there in verse 18. And if you have some other pre-thought about those other verses, obviously, Connor, feel free to draw those in. He says, I am the good shepherd. And he's talking to Pharisees here. That's clear because of other context in the verses. The good shepherd lays down his life for the sheep. The hired hand is not the shepherd and does not own the sheep. So when he sees the wolf coming, he abandons the sheep and runs away. Then the wolf attacks the flock and scatters it. The man runs away because he is a hired hand and cares nothing for the sheep. I am the good shepherd. I know my sheep, and my sheep know me. Just as the Father knows me, and I know the Father, and I lay down my life for the sheep. I have other sheep that are not of this sheep pen. I must bring them also. They too will listen to my voice, and there shall be one flock and one shepherd. The reason my Father loves me is that I lay down my life, only to take it up again. No one takes it from me, but I lay it down of my own accord. I have authority to lay it down and authority to take it up again. This command I received from my Father. So, Connor, what amazes you about what Jesus says here?
What amazes me is the way that Jesus claims ownership over the sheep. I think about how many times I've heard in my life people make grandiose statements, or they make claims to be the authority, the leader over people, and how often, if not almost all of the time, it sounds there's some sort of selfishness there. There's some sort of power seeking there. There's some sort of fear of trying to prove to myself or prove to other people that, yes, I am the owner in the situation. I am the good shepherd. I am the leader in the situation. And the fact that Jesus, when he refers to his flock, when he refers to his people, his group of people, that he can say these are my people, like they're mine, and I lead them and I protect them and I look after them. But there's not this overbearing sense of, and now I get to direct every single aspect of their life, right? That there's the protectiveness, there's the seeking out for what is absolutely best for the sheep here. But there's not this like, here's where I think I would have been taught what a good shepherd does in this situation. So I protect from the wolves, and then I go in and I measure every grain of grass that the shepherd's gonna. I make sure that they eat the exact kind of grass that they have to eat. I micromanage down to the level. I consume myself with making sure that they get the exact steps right. But this perspective for me, and we've talked about this before, that there's imagery here. There's this is imagery that Jesus is using to describe his relationship to his people. But that idea for me of Jesus just being this, having ownership, but it not coming from selfishness or not coming from a desire to show his power, the desire to be in power, but just coming out of love and a desire for good for his people. That is something that even the best of us, I feel like, even the best of Jesus followers, when we try to enact that in our groups, when God does call us to leadership, it's something that like is such a imperfect art, if you will, that the fact that Jesus masters it here, the fact that Jesus is in so much, is so much control, it befuddles me and it amazes me.
I'll tell you, I'm trying to hold on to what I'm so captivated by what you just said. This is such a crux of the problem for me, and I think anybody in relation to leadership, and I think anybody that takes leadership, whether that means you're a parent, whether especially once your kid starts interacting with you and starts pushing back on you, whether you have your job, all of a sudden you're leading a teacher at school or in church settings or wherever it is, but when you move into leadership, I think there's a lot of people that don't want leadership. I don't want leadership, and the reason is it's like it's easier for me to say, oh, it's not my circus, not my monkeys. I don't have responsibility there. But then once I have responsibility, now I am fully responsible, which is where the micromanaging comes from. In me, I worked with an organization where we would train students. They'd go have a missions experience. They'd come back, and some of those students would then work with the ongoing students, and they'd become assistants to the process, and their hearts were always good. I can't think of a person I worked with 100 some people doing this. Hearts were always good. But many times the leadership, once they took that on, they became tyrants. They became ogres. These super good-natured people. who I knew as honestly cut ups at times. And can you follow through on anything? And then all of a sudden they were like heavy handed. And I've worked with people, and I've worked with a lot of good people who have decent self-awareness that they recognize, wait a minute, I'm leaning into this. But I do it too. I'm like, okay, I'm either not going to lead or I'm going to lead. And I'm not an organized person, but but I got to make sure it goes right now. And so I'm going to have to be, I bring in perfectionism into that.
Yeah. And I think that comes from, it could come from childhood of like, hey, this is how my parents raised me. This is when I think about leadership in my own life, it was, an authoritarian father figure, or, if my real community was found in the church, and my church was very, very dogmatic and very, this is the way things are and whatever. I think, when for the first time, and because I'm pretty young and it's happened recently, the first time you're put in charge of anybody, you're put in charge of any sort of group, there is it's something. So the phenomenon of imposter syndrome in my generation has just become such a wildly, I think sometimes overused sort of thing. But I do think it's good in the sense that it's kind of starting a conversation and dialogue. But if you don't know what imposter syndrome is, it's the idea that you find yourself in a situation and you feel like you are not qualified, that this is some other person's role, this is some other person's job, this is not, you're not supposed to be here, you're not qualified.
Yeah, somebody else could do this better than me.
Yes. And so anytime you grow up, that I think that's going to happen. And I think, anytime you assume a role, you have this idea of what this role is supposed to be done, how it's supposed to be done, because you've seen other people fill this role, you've seen other people do this role. And if you've had particularly authoritarian figures in your life, especially when it comes to leadership, whether that be in school, whether that be with parents, whether that be at a part-time job, whether that be, whatever the situation would be, and you look at it and say, okay, when I was under somebody, the person above me was authoritarian, and not authoritarian in the way of like, they were authoritarian in the way of domineering. They're authoritarian in the way of it's my way is the only way. Not my way is the way things have to be. And so for me, I think that I think the question is why do we feel that need? So when we get put in positions of power, when people, I think there's psychological reasons, but what are the spiritual reasons for why, when somebody who had no predisposition, it seemingly didn't have any predisposition to be a dogmatic and authoritarian, domineering leader, why suddenly when placed in that position do they begin to enact those sort of policies or become that sort of leader?
Yeah, I think, and this shows up probably differently in different situations, but if you perceive life and death dynamics, which I do with God, like God's big premise is you're living the short part of your life right now, and then you'll move into the long part of your life after death, after your physical death. And so then you add to that, now you're leading people, which is why I think a lot of people shy away from even talking about who am I discipling, or who even if you try to issue it as a mutual relationship, who am I discipling with? It just feels like, like when Paul says, follow me as I follow Christ, most people will follow that with, now we're no Paul. And I want to push back and say, no, we're all Paul. Mm-hmm. And Paul said late in life, he was the worst of sinners.
Yeah.
Not he used to be the worst of sinners, but he was the worst of sinners. And I think we treat that like it's hyperbole. It's like, oh, Paul's just, trying to make us feel better. Well, then he's a liar. Okay, so he's either the worst of sinners or he's not, but he thinks he's the worst of sinners. And yet he says, follow me as I follow Christ. Well, that should be every one of us. But the reason we don't want to say it is too much responsibility, because we still believe it's not God's work. It's our work that we present to God. Mm. And as long as I think this is my work that I have to present to God at the end, I need everyone to hear me saying, you are a failure in progress. You are a dumpster fire that just burns brighter, because there's no way I can earn my way back. Mm-hmm. Even percentage-wise, because the closer, I always think of Isaiah. Isaiah was maybe the most spiritually minded person in the whole country, and maybe if he was alive today, he'd be the most spiritually minded person in the world. But in the presence of God, he didn't say, I live with a bunch of losers. He says, I'm a loser, and I live with a bunch of losers. He had no pretense. In other words, if I play mediocre basketball, and we're picking basketball teams, but I see everybody else is terrible, I'm not mentioning my foibles. I'm not mentioning, I only have a little bit of experience. I'm like, hey, I'm shining here. But in the presence of God, his superiority over all of his brothers and sisters, the Israelites, was so nothing. He's like, I'm the same as them.
And this is why I think Jason and I are so all the time, and maybe it gets annoying to the fact that we want to talk about our failings and our failures and our doubts, because people still, maybe Jason and I talk about our doubts enough. We're like, okay, Jason and Connor aren't perfect, but then there's somebody else who you're going to have that vision of, right? There's going to be some other speaker, there's going to be some other preacher, there's going to be some other author that you see, and like, no, of course, now maybe Jason and Connor talk about their doubts, and I know inherently that they've got some struggles, but man, if I could get to the Andy Stanley level, or man, if I could be Matt Chandler, or man, if I could be Beth Moore, whatever, whoever your person is. And I think that one of the best things in leadership, I think in this passage, Jesus talks about how he's been given this power, given this authority by the Father. He's been given this command by the Father, and he's submitting, and he's being open with where it's coming from. And I think one of the best things that can happen in leadership when you find yourself in that position is being open and honest with, hey, this is coming from a separate place. This leadership isn't, now it was for Jesus, but for us, when we are placed in leadership, whether it be in a spiritual sense or it's at work or it's, whatever the sense may be, is when we're open and honest with, I'm not placed in this position because I'm better than you. I'm not placed in this position because I'm more spiritual, I have all the right answers, or whatever the thing may be. This is coming from, this is springing out of the life, out of the knowledge, out of the wisdom, out of the presence of God that has worked through me my entire life. And I think, I'm just going to stop there because we could just keep going on that. But man, I think it's just so important that we all find ourselves in different leadership positions. We all find ourselves, having influence over others. And we all think that we're the ones who, man, if they knew this thing or they knew that thing, we all think that we're alone in that.
Right.
But man, if we just keep putting in front of us, and not like a gossipy sense, or not in a way, well, if they're messing up, then it's okay if I mess up. But in a very real way of saying, like you said with Isaiah, man, I'm a loser, and we're all losers here together, and there's a lot of safety there.
Mm-hmm. And it's interesting from the human perspective of Jesus' life. Why was Jesus in the position he was in? Because God put him there.
Mm-hmm.
Why are you in the position of leadership that you're in? Well, if you're following God, God put you there.
Yeah.
And that's really important. I was talking to somebody that was given a huge task just yesterday, and I know he perceived it. As he's talking, it's like, it's way beyond me. Like, I don't even understand. Here's what I've led before, and now I'm being asked to do this. What's the baby step there, And my response to him is, number one, I feel the same way the vast majority of the time. Number two, I look around when I'm in a situation, I'm like, has God provided anybody else to do this? Then it must be my job. And God's so good at his job that if I'm misreading and I move into a job that's not mine, and believe me, I've had this experience, God will let me know.
Yeah.
That person will stop following me, or that system will stop responding to my influence.
Yeah. And the thing that you just said is why what I talked about amazes me so much, because when we do wrap around our mind around the idea, if I'm following God, he's led me to this position of leadership, it can so easily turn into, well, then I have all the right answers. I better have all the right answers. Right. And if everybody just listened to what I said, or everyone just agreed with what I said, everyone just went along with what I said because I've been put in power by God, then things would go the way. And you either find yourself going into it's not working out because nobody's listening to me, or no, it's not working out because I'm a fraud. And I think this is one of those things that this is such a gift that Jesus doesn't just leave us in the place of, or that God doesn't just leave us in the place of, here's your authority, and I've given it to you. But Jesus models it over, and I'm sure we'll talk about it. We'll move on here in a second. But Jesus models here that the leader is the one who gives up their life. The leader is the one who sacrifices. The leader is the one who is first one to the mat. And man, I think that is, it is such a gift that God doesn't just leave it where he could, where I think a lot of us assume he leaves it, or assumes where we're supposed to leave it. So Jason, what amazes you?
So you've already segued for me. If we were to ask in a generic sense, we hadn't read this passage, say, tell me why Jesus is qualified to be the Good Shepherd. I might go, well, he's very wise. You know what I mean? Eventually I'd get to he has no sin. Because that's what I was all my life. If you would have asked me, does Jesus brag incessantly about the fact, or mention incessantly, because bragging would be a sin, does he mention incessantly about how he has no sin? I'm like, oh, he must. Because wouldn't you? If you had no sin, if you realized, wait a minute, you're talking about, I've never had sin. You know what I mean? It would come up. What's fascinating to me, and I've read this passage before, probably many, many times, but it's got 5 times in 8 verses he says, lay down my life, lay down my life, lay down my life. The basis of him being the Good Shepherd, is his commitment to lay down his life. And I think I think we make a mistake here in thinking he's talking about his death. I think it includes his death, his eventual death. I think it's every moment of every day, because this is a present tense. Verse 11, the Good Shepherd lays down, like it's happening right now. It's not just future tense. I'm looking for where it shows up again. And I lay down my life for my sheep. That's present tense. There in 15, he says it several other times. This is a dynamic, and I'm gonna shift to perplexed here in a second, because this is as it often is the other side of the coin. Is he is saying what you just said. The Good Shepherd, the leader, the one that God is using, is not the one that has the right answers. Jesus never references his wisdom. He never references the fact that he understood the only Bible they had, which were scrolls from what we call the Old Testament. He never says, I know more. He never references miracles. See, we always think I'd be like Jesus, but I can't walk on water. And Jesus is like, it doesn't matter. I think Jesus would shake us in righteous indignation and say, will you stop focusing on the miracle? Because guess who wasn't focused on the miracles? Jesus wasn't focused on the miracles. Matter of fact, when he casts out or forgives the man's sin, the paralytic, there's a sense he's not going to heal that guy, which that means there's at least 5 guys going home pretty upset. The paralytic and the 4 guys that lowered him through the roof. But you get the sense if the Pharisees weren't there judging him for blaspheming, he'd have been like, hey, enjoy your sin forgiveness. You know what I mean? He literally says, so you'll know that I really did something there when I forgave your sins. Get up and walk, you know? And there's a reason for these miracles, but we way over-focus on the things that Jesus way under-focused on. His over-focus, if you will, his main focus is, I'm laying down my life. I'm dying to myself, not just the end, all the time. And so I'm going to shift real quickly and say, and I think you'll be able to build on this in the same way. What perplexes me is, how did you do that? Because I can lay down my life for 5 minutes, maybe even 5 days, but eventually I'm like, it's your turn to lay down your life. This is the story of my marriage right there. It's like, look how good I'm doing. I'm being a great husband or a great parent or a great whatever. And then I hit my point and I'm like, nope, I'm done laying down my life. It's time for you to lay down your life.
Yeah.
And that probably is the root of almost every problem I've ever had, especially in leadership.
No, man, that is, I think, so important. And I think it's important to recognize, man, how this plays out. Man, there's 1,000 different ways this can play out. I've seen people who, man, they really revel in the martyrdom of laying down their life. They really revel in the idea that they're the ones, being trampled, or they're the ones being taken advantage of, or whatever story they want to tell themselves, or whatever story they want to play a part in. And I think this is something. One of the things that there's not this sense here. Just tacking on what you said, there's not this sense here of begrudging laying down of life. There's not a sense of, okay, I'll lay down part of my life, or okay, I'll lay my down 7 times, but this 8th time, I'll lay it down halfway, but man, just you've got to start figuring it out. You got to start working it out, and just the persistence with which Jesus talks about laying down his life, and that there's not this expectation that it's going to come to an end. Like that's a perplexing. That's not my perplexion, but that is a perplexing thing, and almost an impossible thing. How do we get to like you said? How do we get to the mindset of like, well, I'm not just laying down my life to get to the weekend where I can take a break from laying down my life, but literally it's going to happen every single day, every single moment. God's calling me to that every single moment until I die. And I think that's the power of what you talked about earlier with what Jesus is doing here, is this active laying down, and ultimately the ultimate laying down of his life in the physical sense. I think this is one of those, it's such an important thing to keep both pieces in mind. It would be so easy. It is so easy for me, it is easy for me to begrudgingly lay down my life. It's so easy to sacrifice, but attach a sense of moral superiority, to attach a sense of, well, I'm a real follower now. I'm a real leader. It is so easy to attach these things, I think the dirty secret is that when we attach those extra benefits, when we tack on those extra things so that we can get those extra feelings, we're not truly laying down our life in the full sense of what it's meant to be. And I think this is the astounding astounding nature of who Jesus was, that he never added those things on, right? Like for me, there's plenty of times where I will lay down my life for somebody, or lay down my life for my wife over and over and over again. But there's always that extra little add-on that I'm giving to myself, whether that be in martyrdom, whether that be in, well, these are good husband points, whether that be in, well, people are going to notice how good I'm being, whatever the thing is that little gift I'm giving to myself. The fact that Jesus never gives himself that gift, man, that's crazy. I don't even know, like, the amount of times I have laid down my life in the purest sense of what it's called to be. I think the number is probably shockingly lower than I would have expected pre this conversation.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and we do subconsciously. We live in constant comparison. Even the guy that says, "I don't care what anybody thinks." I've heard that all my life. There's always that person. I don't care what anybody thinks. And then you watch that person, and what they're really saying is, "I don't care what you think about me in this one area." Mm-hmm. But if you spend enough time with that person, they care about something else. Everybody cares about what other people think in some area. You know what I mean? And multiple areas. And what that means then is we're living in, that usually leads to some form of living in comparison. Mm-hmm. You know what I mean? How do I know I'm good? Well, I'm better than you, which leads us back to your point on that whole dynamic of Isaiah wasn't better. I was talking about Isaiah, but your general point about this idea of what separates the hired hand from the good shepherd in this dynamic. And I think, it's interesting. Jesus isn't condemning the hired hand. That just jumped into my head. Mm-hmm. He's just stating a fact. The hired hand leaves. Now I feel judgment towards the hired hand, but he's saying, I need you to understand who I am. Mm-hmm. And the point of contrast is the hired hand doesn't do this because he's not going to lay down his life. He's the hired hand. It's almost, again, intonation. It's almost as if Jesus said, yeah, he's the hired hand. Like, of course, that's what hired hands do. They don't own the sheep, Yeah. And I think that part, that idea of me living in comparison is so detrimental. I usually think because it makes me feel less than. Oh, Connor is so good at, like, one of the things you're really good at is you are so much more tuned in. You give me a lot of credit sometimes that I know, and I just smile and nod. But you are well studied. Like, you are really well studied in a lot of currently, And I study, but not trending stuff. And I'm not a big reader. You know what I mean? So you just bring a lot more new stuff, I feel, than I do. So that comparison makes me feel less. But honestly, where I spend the majority of my time comparing is when something makes me feel more. I feel a little insecure. I feel a little down. I feel a little bit discouraged. And I'm like, let me think about somebody that's less than me. And consciously, I don't do it usually. But subconsciously, it's there. And then we're back to that dynamic. At the foot of the cross, we're all the same. And I get that. But to me, this is more impacting that the guy that always had the right to say, hey, just want to remind you, I'm still superior. Mm-hmm. He uses that whatever you call license to constantly die to himself. And here's the thing this kills me. He's still doing it. Yeah. Jesus is still dying to himself in his relationship with me because he's putting up with me. Mm-hmm. And I'm like, man, you deserve to be my good shepherd. Yeah. Because you keep dying to yourself for me.
So that helps me. One of my perplexions was, in 17, it says, the reason my Father loves me is that I lay down my life only to take it up again. So this idea, you saying that kind of helps put it into perspective for me. Because saying, this is like a big theological statement. For the reason my Father loves me, the reason, that's a big thing to say, is because of how Jesus leads, because of how he sacrifices, because of how he lays down his life. I think about, I think for me, that dynamic you're talking about here, how, why is Jesus so insistent on this? Why does he keep reiterating? Why does he keep saying this over? Why is there so much repetition here? And the weight that Jesus gives this is just, man, it is that. Wait, sorry, I don't even know if I articulated how you helped clarify that for me, but it did help me clarify. So what perplexes me is this is how. So like you kind of talked about earlier, Jesus is responding around near the Pharisees. And in 16 it says, I have other sheep that are not of the sheep pen. I must bring them also. They too will listen to my voice, and there shall be one flock and one shepherd. Here's my perspective on this. If I don't know farming at all, and I go on a road trip, and we see cows through several different fields. Cows are cows to me. I don't know any difference. I'll see a different color, but they're just all the same to me. Even male and female cows. Is there a difference? I'm not sure. I literally have no knowledge whatsoever of the differences, of the distinctions. Same thing with sheep. Same thing with that. And the fact here that here's the idea that Jesus brings here, that there are people outside of the group that he is talking to that are part of his group, that are part of the people that he is calling to him, his sheep that he wants to shepherd, that belong to him, and they will become part of the same flock. So this idea for me is so it is so hard, because when I think of we're all God's people, like we're all part of it. Like when I think about other people who don't share the same context of life, or I think about the difference of the Jews and the Gentiles and all like we're all part of the same flock. Awesome. Fantastic. Gentiles and Jews alike, we're all part of the same flock. But when I get down to the differences, like when I actually begin to think about the differences in these groups, the differences of the flocks, man, it just begins like kind of similar to your perplexion. How, right? Like when I begin to study down deep and go, okay, here are the differences in the sheep in this separate pen, and here are the differences in the sheep in this separate pen, and somehow God is able to weave them all together, somehow able to bring them all together in the same flock and lead them in a healthy and good way, and that they would be a part of the same flock. Like that, like for me, I just look at the state of our world. I look at the state of our church, and I believe ultimately the church is as a net good for the world, and I think it will be and will continue to be a net good. But I just go, how, right? Like we struggle so much with the differences that we see in people, the differences that we see even among fellow believers, and just the ability, the fact here that Jesus is. I don't even know where else to go with it, but do you kind of understand what I'm saying?
Yeah, I do. It's funny because this is like typical from my reading of the word. I see that verse and I'm like, yeah, Gentiles, and then I move on to the next thing. You know what I mean? And this is why I like our process, because it forces me to dig in and say, what's amazing about what he just said? That verse in particular, what is equal parts amazing and perplexing is the Jewish man, the Jewish person that grew up in Judaism, that became a Christian on the day of Pentecost, okay? And we'll say they lived in Jerusalem. So they're around Christians, they're around the apostles, they're kicked out in Acts 8, they're kicked out. They now, for the first time in probably 5 generations or more, they have to move out of Israel and go, to Antioch or wherever, you know what I mean? The jolt to that Jewish Christian, I've never thought about this before, but the jolt to that Jewish Christian living with Gentile Christians, that had to be just shocking.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? And that's why I think, now I'm just thinking out loud here, but that's why I think God didn't, it's funny, God tells them in Acts 1:8, go from Jerusalem to Judea to Samaria, and nobody moves. And then when oh man, this is kind of amazing. It's just playing on my own head right now. And then when the persecution broke out and John's brother James was, murdered and everybody scattered except the apostles, I was always like, God, why wouldn't you send the apostles? They're the eyewitnesses. I think it's because the Jews, had to be sent out to these Gentiles as the ones in need. In other words, has they gone as the ones that were the missionaries, they would have had such a hard time breaking free from their Jewish Christianity that it would have been oppressive. And we know they have problems even without that. Paul is the one, the reason, and I'm sorry, this is all just captivating me right now, but the reason God chose Paul over Peter was Paul was known, every situation he was in, he was the less than. Because he probably, until he went on his far journeys, he probably was responsible for putting somebody to death that was in the family of the person he's talking to in Antioch and Jerusalem and all these places. So he entered less than. That's why he's the perfect Jewish guy to reach out to the Gentiles, because he was so convinced of his less thanness, whereas the Jews were so convinced of their more than-ness that they talked openly about their disregard for people. I mean, this relates to when we think of racism, and that's all this is. It's just, but it's racism that Peter was raised in and all these people were raised in. Racism has always existed since there have been races, you know what I mean? Because it comes down to self-preservation, self-absorption, and at the root of it, it's being unloving. You want to get rid of racism, you have to love. You want to get rid of any sin, you have to love.
Yeah,
you know,
you have to lay down your life.
Yeah, and that it's that kind of love we're talking about. You know what I mean? And see, this is that dynamic of, back to this passage, when he says this short sentence, I mean, I'm sure the apostles were like, yeah, because they had to. They couldn't absorb all this that he was saying, and they obviously showed great evidence they didn't absorb what he was saying most of the time. But it's this dynamic of what Jesus is doing is breathtaking, almost every word. Mm-hmm. And to us, it's John 10.
Yeah.
Like this is just, how could you, I mean, if you imagine, pick your 10 friends on Facebook that are the most opposed to each other, and then imagine planting a church tomorrow, and Jesus said, I'm going to bring all 10 of those to be the leaders of your church. That's not as shocking as what Jesus did bringing Gentiles into Jewish church.
Man, that's a very helpful analogy for me. And I think about, like, we have this tendency to blow up our problems today, and like, nobody's ever had these problems. Nobody's had it as bad as we've had. Nobody's been as separated as we've had it. And in fact, I'm not Southern Baptist, but I'm just always fascinated by different church culture things. There was this big election for the Southern Baptist thing that happened just yesterday from when we were recording, and like just this massive division in how they're going to go, and what, like, they were voting for president, and it was like 52-48. It was like very close. They're just fighting, horrible words said on all parts by followers of Jesus. And I look at something like that of people in the same denomination. I'm like, man, they're going to have to split. Like, they're not even part of my tribe, but I'm like, there's no way they can go forward. There's no way they can be unified. And I think about, man, I just have this implicit belief that I act out, and I just go, there's no way. Like, maybe in some far off future, there can be unification between these group of believers or these group of believers or whatever, or maybe in my life.
Once all their anger dies down.
Yeah, once everybody calms down, maybe it can happen. But I think about, like, there wasn't this sense of like, well, once the Jews and Gentiles calm down, then they can be a part of the group. Once there's this diffusing of the situation, then we can kind of assimilate. Then we can kind of be a part of all of one flock. And the fact that Jesus is doing all this, like you said, this monumental change in the perspective for his followers, of the expectation of how they're going to live out their lives going forward, what this new thing is going to look like. The fact that for Jesus, Jesus isn't concerned. Jesus isn't like, hey, you're all going to be a part of one flock and it's going to like work out perfect. Like it's so hard to even fathom here of what it looks like to be part of one flock, what it looks like to be unified, what it looks like to be together. And maybe this is where, like, hey, being a Catholic would probably be helpful in this situation, or being Orthodox or whatever. But yeah, man, even then, okay, I'm a Catholic and I'm part of a religion that has 1 billion people around the world. There's still another like 1.5 billion that claim Christianity, that claim being followers of Jesus. And how the heck do we unite with him? There's just 1,000 different ways. And the fact that Jesus over and over and over again is just repeatedly driving home this point of unified. You're to be unified. You're a part of the same group. You're a part of the same flock. I want to weep, because it seems to me like there's something that we have de-emphasized that for Jesus was a massive big deal.
And I think, it's funny. I don't hear this much, but I was raised in a culture like, that's going to happen over my dead body. You know what I mean? And that just popped into my head. It's like, that's how it's got to happen, over our dead bodies. And prior to my physical dead body, over my dead life. If I want life, and this idea of raising up your life again, when Jesus says, don't give up your, if you give up your life, you'll get your life back. But if you hold on to your life, you lose it. And that's that same spirit here. How do you want life in your life? Do you want life in your church? Quit blaming everybody else. I don't care if you perceive yourself as the least important person or the most important person. Jason, quit blaming everybody else. Person that's listening, quit blaming everybody else. Die to yourself and trust God that he sees you and that he will reward you. Keep doing it. And when you stink at it, forgive yourself and keep doing it. You know what I mean? This is the key. And I believe in this life, fruit will show, but I certainly believe in the next life, you'll be like, man, that was the investment. Yeah. That was what I wanted to do. That's what I want to remember. That's the significant stuff, because the lady that confronted me, I guarantee you she didn't take any pleasure in it. I know her. I guarantee you. Changed me forever. Yeah. You know what I mean? But she had to find the gumption in herself, knowing the world where women don't talk to men strong in churches of Christ, And honestly, nobody talks to anybody strong unless they hold all the power, and then it's usually ugly and dominating. But it's that idea of her saying, hey, here's this. Man, that death to self, and I had to die to myself to accept it eventually. But that death to self, man, changed my life. And that's what I have to keep in mind, is I can't judge by human standards if I've done too much. I have to keep going back to God and saying, what is good death to self here?
Hope you are blessed by today. Hope you're blessed by our words. If you hear anything that we said, whether it be about something we said towards the end of the episode, or it was completely unrelated and something that you found along the way that you want to share with us, we'd love to hear that. You can contact us by going to our website, amazedandperplexed.com. Grace, peace, and love.